It was a quiet evening, the city winding down after the long, hot day. The glow of streetlights flickered along a tree-lined street in a peaceful urban neighborhood. It was the kind of area where most people locked up their homes, turned off their porch lights, and prepared for bed early. But the night was still young for Eric Williams. Driving through the calm, dimly lit roads in his sleek, black sedan, Eric felt a sense of satisfaction after a productive day at work. Dressed in a crisp, tailored suit, the 35-year-old attorney had just finished a long but successful meeting at his law firm. His career as a corporate lawyer had taken off in the last few years, bringing him the kind of financial success that afforded him luxuries like the car he was driving. But no amount of money could shield him from the uncomfortable feeling he got when he noticed the police cruiser pull up behind him. In the distance, two officers sat in the cruiser parked outside a small diner, bathed in the dull yellow light of the street lamps. Officer Daniels, a veteran of the force with over 15 years of service, stirred his coffee and glanced at his partner, Officer Brooks, who had only been on the job for a year. Daniels was known for being tough, aggressive when he needed to be, and many said he was quick to judge. Tonight, as he leaned back in the driver's seat, his eyes followed a black car that slowly rolled by. "That car doesn't belong in this neighborhood," Daniels muttered, tossing his half-empty coffee cup onto the dashboard. Brooks shifted uneasily in his seat. "How do you figure? He's not speeding or anything." Daniels shrugged, sitting up straighter as the taillights of Eric's car disappeared around the corner. "Just a hunch. Let's go check it out." Without another word, Daniels fired up the engine and pulled out onto the street, trailing Eric's car at a distance. His partner didn't protest, but Brooks' discomfort grew as he looked out the window. The new recruit had heard stories about Daniels' reputation, how he sometimes overreacted during routine stops. But as a rookie, Brooks wasn't in a position to question his superior. Inside the sedan, Eric noticed the police car in his rearview mirror. His jaw tightened as he glanced down at his speedometer, confirming that he wasn't speeding. Everything was in order, he had nothing to worry about. Still, he couldn't shake the familiar tension creeping up his spine. "Here we go again," Eric muttered to himself, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the steering wheel. He had experienced this scenario too many times to count. Black man in a nice car, driving through a quiet neighborhood at night. It didn't take much for him to guess what would happen next. Sure enough, the flashing blue and red lights reflected in his rearview mirror. Eric sighed heavily as he pulled his car to the side of the road, parking neatly under a street lamp. Officer Daniels parked directly behind him and got out of the cruiser, his hand casually resting near his holster. Brooks followed suit but kept a step behind his partner, watching the situation unfold with growing unease. Eric took a deep breath, keeping his hands visible on the steering wheel. He knew the drill. Stay calm, stay respectful, comply. He watched Daniels approach the driver's side window, his boots clacking against the pavement with each heavy step. The officer knocked on the glass with his flashlight. "License and registration," Daniels barked, his voice cold and direct. Eric rolled down the window and nodded, reaching slowly for his wallet in the cup holder. He knew better than to make any sudden movements, especially at this hour. "Sure, officer," he said evenly, handing over his driver's license and registration. Daniels snatched the documents and glanced over them, his brow furrowing as he took in Eric's credentials. "Eric Williams, he muttered, glancing at the registration. "This your car?" "Yes, sir," Eric replied. "Is there a problem?" Daniels leaned closer to the window, his eyes narrowing suspiciously. "You live around here?" Eric's fingers tightened around the steering wheel, but he forced himself to stay composed. "I'm driving home from work. I'm a lawyer. I live in the city." Daniels scoffed, his eyes still scanning the registration. "You're a lawyer, huh?" His tone dripped with disbelief. "And what kind of law do you practice?" "Corporate law," Eric answered calmly, keeping his gaze forward. He knew what was happening. This was no routine stop. This was something else. Officer Brooks stood off to the side, watching quietly as Daniels continued his interrogation. He could feel the tension rising but wasn't sure what to do. He had been on the force long enough to recognize when something wasn't right, and right now this didn't feel right. Daniels handed back Eric's license and registration but didn't back away from the car. "What's a guy like you doing in this neighborhood at this hour?" Eric clenched his jaw, his patience wearing thin. Like I said, officer, I'm on my way home. Is there a specific reason you pulled me over? Daniels smirked, his eyes scanning the interior of the luxury car. Just a routine check, he said, but his tone was anything but routine. Mind stepping out of the vehicle. Eric's heart rate spiked, but he remained outwardly calm. He knew his rights, and this was where the line was drawn. No, officer, I haven't done anything wrong, and there's no probable cause for you to ask me to step out. Daniel's smirk faded, replaced by a scowl. You refusing to comply? Eric locked eyes with the officer, his voice steady but firm. I'm not refusing, I'm simply stating my rights. Brooks shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Daniels and Eric. This was escalating quickly, and the rookie officer didn't like where it was heading. Daniels' hand hovered near his holster, and for a moment the air felt thick with the possibility of something much worse. You want to play that game? Daniels growled. For a moment, the tension between Eric and Officer Daniels hung thick in the night air. Eric's pulse quickened as he felt the weight of the moment pressing on him, but he wasn't about to back down. He had learned from experience that once you let an officer like Daniels think they have complete control, the situation could spiral out of hand. Daniels, on the other hand, was used to people complying without hesitation. The look in Eric's eyes, calm but firm, only irritated him more. He hated when people, especially black men, questioned his authority. His hand rested on the grip of his holstered gun, not because he thought Eric was a threat, but because the gesture alone carried power. You think you're smart? Daniel's tone was sharper now, almost threatening. Corporate lawyer, fancy car, bet you think you're better than me. Eric's gaze didn't waver. He was well versed in these power plays, having grown up knowing that, no matter how much success he achieved, moments like this would come. His heart raced, but he kept his face composed. I don't think I'm better than anyone, officer. I'm just asserting my rights as a citizen. Brooks took a small step forward, sensing the hostility escalating. He could feel his own nerves on edge. Something about the way Daniels was handling this didn't sit right with him. He'd seen stops like this before, but there was always an unspoken understanding that if the person complied, things didn't have to get out of hand. Yet here they were on the verge of something unnecessary, something dangerous. Hey, Daniels, Brooks began, trying to sound casual but with enough urgency to break the rising tension. Maybe we should run his plates again, just to be sure everything checks out. Daniels ignored him, his eyes locked on Eric, unwilling to let go of the power he was desperately clinging to. Step out of the car, he repeated, his voice growing harder. Don't make me ask again. Eric's fingers gripped the steering wheel tighter. He knew the statistics, he knew how easily this could turn into another tragic story on the evening news. And yet he also knew that stepping out now without probable cause could lead to more harassment. Either way, he felt trapped. I'm not resisting, Officer Eric said, keeping his voice steady but firm. But I also know that I haven't broken any laws. I've given you my license and registration. I've answered your questions. There's no reason for me to step out of this car. Daniel's face twisted with anger. This wasn't how things usually went for him. He was used to people folding, giving in, especially when he started to push. But here was Eric, calm, collected, refusing to back down, and it infuriated him. Out of the car, Daniel shouted this time, his hand now fully on his gun. The sudden escalation sent a chill down Eric's spine. He could feel the situation slipping further out of control, and for a moment he considered just stepping out to avoid making things worse. But his instincts told him that giving in wouldn't make this end any better. If anything, it could give Daniels the opening he needed to turn the situation more violent. Brooks' unease grew. He stepped up beside Daniels, trying to de-escalate the situation. Daniels, seriously, man, let's just call it in and check his information again. We don't want this getting out of hand. Daniels shot Brooks a warning glance, his authority being questioned not just by Eric but now by his own partner. You're still new to this, Brooks, Daniels snapped, but you're going to learn real quick that people like him always have something to hide. Eric's heart pounded harder, his breath steady but shallow. Officer, I'm not hiding anything. You know that. This is unnecessary. Brooks, now visibly uncomfortable, took a small step back. He didn't want to cause a scene in front of his senior officer, but it was clear to him that this was quickly turning into something it didn't need to be. Suddenly, from down the street, headlights appeared, approaching the scene slowly. The flashing lights of the police car must have drawn someone's attention. As the car neared, Eric noticed the familiar make of the vehicle. It was another police cruiser. Relief briefly washed over him, thinking perhaps this might bring a more level-headed officer to the situation. The approaching cruiser pulled up behind Daniel's vehicle, and two officers stepped out. Sergeant Thomas, a seasoned and respected member of the precinct, approached with a calm but authoritative presence. He had heard the backup call on the radio and came to see what was going on. "What's going on here?" Sergeant Thomas asked, his tone even but with an undercurrent of seriousness. Daniel straightened, trying to maintain his authority. "Routine stop. Just trying to get this guy out of the car for a quick search." Sergeant Thomas looked at Eric, who remained sitting with both hands on the wheel, calm but clearly on edge. He then glanced back at Daniels. "And why does he need to get out of the car?" Daniels hesitated, stumbling over his words for a second. "Just routine procedure." Sergeant Thomas raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. He approached the driver's window, glancing briefly at Eric's license, which Daniels had handed back earlier. He studied the situation for a moment, taking in the posture of both men. Thomas had been around long enough to know when a stop was spiraling out of control. "Mr. Williams," Sergeant Thomas said, addressing Eric directly, "you're free to go. There's no reason for you to be here any longer." Daniels looked like he had been slapped in the face. "Sergeant, I said he's free to go," Thomas repeated, his voice firmer now. "We're not here to harass innocent people. There's no probable cause for him to be stopped any longer." Eric glanced at Sergeant Thomas, surprised but grateful. He could feel the weight of the moment lifting, but he didn't move just yet. His eyes shifted to Daniels, who looked both embarrassed and furious, his hands still resting on his holstered weapon. "Thank you, Sergeant," Eric said calmly, slowly lowering his hands from the wheel and starting the engine again. He backed his car away from the curb, his heart still racing but his mind clear. He had stood his ground, and for now it seemed like that was enough. As Eric pulled away, the confrontation lingering in his mind, Daniels stood stiffly, his pride clearly wounded. But Sergeant Thomas wasn't done. "Daniels, we need to talk," he said sternly, signaling to the other officers to give them space. Eric drove off, but the night had left a bitter taste in his mouth. He had won this battle, but he knew it wouldn't be the last time he'd face such a situation. Eric drove in silence, his mind replaying the events of the last few minutes. The confrontation with Officer Daniels still lingered in the back of his thoughts, but he couldn't shake the sense that this wasn't over. As the night street stretched ahead, his grip tightened on the steering wheel. He tried to focus on getting home, but every glance in the rearview mirror brought the memory of those flashing lights back to him. He couldn't help but think of how easily things could have gone the other way. He had seen it too many times, black men like him, stopped for no reason, caught in a web of escalating tension that often ended tragically. Tonight it hadn't come to that, but the taste of injustice was still bitter in his mouth. Eric sighed heavily, turning down a quieter street. His apartment wasn't far now, but his phone buzzed on the passenger seat, breaking his thoughts. He reached for it at a red light, glancing at the screen. It was a text from his younger brother, Malcolm. "Malcolm, you okay? Saw the news about police stops in your area. Hit me back." Eric couldn't help but smirk at the timing. His brother was always quick to check in, especially when something like this was going on. Malcolm had chosen a different path from Eric, working as a high-profile civil rights attorney, always in the middle of heated cases that dealt with racial injustice. They were close, but sometimes Malcolm's work made Eric feel like he should be doing more. Eric tapped out a quick reply, "Yeah, I just got pulled over. All good now, we'll talk later." Just as he put his phone down, something in his rearview mirror caught his attention. His stomach clenched. A pair of headlights was closing in fast from behind, and they weren't just passing by, they were tailing him. Eric's heartbeat quickened as he realized the car gaining on him was another police cruiser. He groaned inwardly. Could they really be doing this again? 2 stops in one night? He pulled over once more, hoping it was just another misunderstanding, but deep down he already knew what was happening. As the cruiser came to a stop behind him, the doors opened, and 2 officers stepped out, Officer Daniels and his partner, Officer Brooks. It was clear now that Daniels wasn't letting this go. The sergeant may have let Eric drive away earlier, but Daniels wasn't about to let his ego take a hit without trying to reassert control. Eric's pulse raced as Daniels approached the car with a cold expression on his face. Officer Brooks trailed behind, looking even more uneasy than before. "This is harassment," Eric muttered under his breath as he rolled down the window. Daniels didn't waste time. "Step out of the car, Williams," he demanded, his voice low but seething with anger. "Now." Eric looked up at him, incredulous. "I just went through this with you, officer. What's the reason this time? You've already seen my ID. You know I haven't done anything wrong." Daniels' face darkened. "Don't make this harder than it has to be. Step out." Eric clenched his jaw. He knew that fighting back in this moment could only make things worse, but he also knew his rights. He wasn't going to let Daniels get away with this kind of abuse. He took a breath, his voice steady. "I'm not getting out of this car without a reason. Officer, you know this is harassment." A muscle in Daniels' jaw twitched. "You're resisting an officer's orders." Brooks shifted uncomfortably. "Daniels, maybe we should." "Shut up," Brooks. Daniels snapped, cutting his partner off before turning back to Eric. "You think you're smart? Think you're untouchable because you're a lawyer? Well, guess what? I've seen plenty of guys like you. Doesn't matter what suit you wear or what title you throw around, you're just another guy who doesn't belong in this neighborhood." Eric felt a familiar anger bubbling inside, but he fought to keep his composure. This wasn't new to him, but every time it happened, the sting was just as sharp. Daniels leaned closer to the window, his eyes narrowing. "So are you going to get out of the car, or are we going to have a real problem here?" Eric stared back at him, his mind racing through his options. He could keep resisting, stand up for his rights, but it was becoming clearer that Daniels was looking for any excuse to escalate the situation. Eric knew that one wrong move could turn this from a bad situation to a life-threatening one. Before he could respond, another car pulled up behind Daniels' cruiser, and this time Eric felt a strange mix of relief and anxiety. The familiar blue lights of another police vehicle flickered, and a tall figure stepped out. It was Sergeant Thomas again. Sergeant Thomas walked up quickly, surveying the scene. His expression darkened as he realized what was happening. "Daniels," he called out firmly, "what the hell are you doing?" Daniels straightened but didn't back down. "Just finishing what I started. This guy's resisting, won't get out of the car." Sergeant Thomas looked over at Eric, then back at Daniels. "I told you to let him go. This is over." But Daniels wasn't backing down this time. His pride was on the line, and he wasn't about to let anyone, not even his superior, make him look weak. "Sergeant, I've got a right to stop anyone acting suspiciously." "This isn't suspicion, Daniels, this is harassment," Thomas shot back, stepping closer to his officer. His voice dropped, stern and commanding. "I'm telling you, stand down, now." For a tense moment, Daniels stood there, fists clenched, eyes burning with frustration. But finally, after what felt like an eternity, he stepped back from the car. Sergeant Thomas exhaled, shaking his head as he looked at Eric. "Sorry about this, Mr. Williams. You're free to go, again." Eric met his eyes and gave a curt nod, though the tension in his chest hadn't fully subsided. "Thank you, Sergeant." As he drove away, the weight of the encounter still heavy on his mind, he glanced back in the rearview mirror one last time. Sergeant Thomas stood firm, staring down Daniels, who was still visibly seething. But for Eric, the encounter wasn't just another random stop, it was a reminder of the constant, unspoken battle he faced every day. After the second encounter with Officer Daniels, Eric drove home, his mind swirling with frustration. He had narrowly avoided a dangerous situation, but the tension weighed heavy on him. Despite Sergeant Thomas stepping in, Eric knew this wasn't over. Daniels' expression had been clear this was personal for him now, and that meant there could be more trouble down the line. The next morning, Eric sat at his kitchen table, sipping a cup of coffee. His phone buzzed with notifications, mostly from work emails, but his mind wasn't on his cases. He kept replaying the events of the previous night. He knew that Daniels wouldn't just let this go, and the fact that he had been stopped twice in one night was no coincidence. Eric decided to call his brother, Malcolm. He had already texted him the night before, but now he needed advice. He dialed Malcolm's number, and after a few rings, Malcolm picked up. "Eric, what's going on?" "I've been thinking about you all night after that text," Malcolm said, concern evident in his voice. "I had another run-in with the police," Eric replied, keeping his tone as calm as possible. "The same officer pulled me over twice in one night. The second time, it felt more like harassment than a routine stop." Malcolm let out a sigh, his voice serious. "That's no coincidence. He's targeting you. Did you get his name?" "Officer Daniels." His partner seemed uncomfortable the whole time, but Daniels. He was aggressive, Malcolm. If it weren't for the sergeant showing up both times, I don't know what would have happened. Malcolm's voice tightened with resolve. "You can't let this slide, Eric. Daniels sounds like the type of cop who thinks he's untouchable. If we don't hold him accountable, he's just going to keep doing this to other people." "I know," Eric admitted, "but I don't know where to start. You know, I've always tried to stay out of these fights. I've focused on my career, not on stirring up trouble." "This isn't about stirring up trouble. It's about standing up for your rights," Malcolm replied firmly. "Look, we'll start with filing an official complaint. We have Sergeant Thomas as a witness, and maybe we can even get Officer Brooks to testify about what happened. If Daniels has a history of this kind of behavior, we might be able to expose him." Eric rubbed his forehead, the exhaustion creeping back in. "All right, let's do it, but I'll need your help. You know I'm not as familiar with the legal side of this." "Don't worry," Malcolm assured him. "I've handled plenty of cases like this. We'll file the complaint today and I'll start digging into Daniel's record. If he's done this before, we'll find it." Later that day, Eric met Malcolm at his law office. Malcolm's space was a stark contrast to the corporate world Eric was used to. There were no polished glass walls or sleek conference rooms. Instead, the office was cluttered with case files, paperwork scattered across his desk, and framed newspaper clippings of past victories against police misconduct. It felt like a battleground for justice. Malcolm wasted no time getting to work. They sat down together, going over every detail of Eric's encounters with Daniels. Malcolm wrote everything down, preparing the official complaint to be submitted to the police department. As they worked, Eric couldn't help but feel a sense of resolve building inside him. This wasn't just about him anymore, this was about standing up to a broken system. "Once we file this complaint, the department will be forced to investigate," Malcolm explained, typing rapidly on his laptop. "If there are any other complaints against Daniels, this will open them up too." "And if they try to brush it under the rug?" Eric asked, his voice laced with doubt. "Then we go public," Malcolm replied confidently. "We've got witnesses, and if we have to, we'll take this to the media. Trust me, they won't be able to ignore it." By the end of the day, the complaint was ready. Eric and Malcolm submitted it to the police department, outlining both stops and detailing Daniel's aggressive behavior. As they left the department, Eric felt the weight of the situation starting to lift slightly. He had taken the first step, but he knew the road ahead would be long and filled with obstacles. Over the next few days, word of the complaint started spreading. Eric hadn't expected it to gain so much attention so quickly, but Malcolm had contacts in the local press, and soon the story of racial profiling by Officer Daniels was making headlines. It wasn't just about Eric anymore. Others who had been stopped by Daniels began coming forward, sharing similar stories of harassment and intimidation. One evening, as Eric was heading home from work, his phone rang. It was Malcolm again, but this time he sounded excited. "Eric, you're not going to believe this," Malcolm said. "What's up?" Eric asked, curious. "I got in touch with Officer Brooks," Malcolm replied, his voice tinged with satisfaction. "He's willing to testify about what happened. He saw everything, and he knows Daniels crossed the line." Eric felt a surge of hope. "Brooks? Really?" "Yeah, he's nervous about going against his partner, but he knows it's the right thing to do. If we can get him to testify, it'll be a huge blow to Daniel's defense." For the first time in days, Eric allowed himself to feel optimistic. The pieces were starting to fall into place. With Brooks on their side and the media attention growing, it seemed like the tides were turning. But Eric knew this was just the beginning. Daniels wasn't the type to back down easily, and the police department would likely rally to protect him. Still, Eric felt ready. He wasn't going to let this go. Eric sat in the dimly lit kitchen of his apartment, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had long gone cold. The events of the night played over and over in his head, each detail etched into his memory like a permanent scar. He had managed to get away safely, but the weight of what had happened, of what could have happened, bore down on him. His phone buzzed again, this time with a call. It was Malcolm, his younger brother and the civil rights attorney. Eric had texted Malcolm earlier, but now, seeing his brother's name flash on the screen, he hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hey," Eric said, his voice low and tired. Eric Malcolm's voice was sharp, tinged with concern. "What happened? You said you got pulled over. Are you okay?" Eric leaned back in his chair, sighing deeply. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just had a run-in with some overzealous cops. It's nothing I haven't dealt with before." Malcolm was quiet for a moment on the other end. When he spoke again, his voice was laced with frustration. "It's not nothing, Eric. It's never nothing. You know that better than anyone." Eric rubbed his forehead, the tension from the night still sitting heavy in his chest. I know, but ... what was I supposed to do? Fight back? Resist? You know how that could have ended." "I'm not saying you should have gotten yourself hurt," Malcolm said, his tone softening slightly. "But you can't just let this slide. It's not just about you, Eric. It's about all of us. This kind of harassment keeps happening because people like Daniels think they can get away with it." Eric nodded, even though his brother couldn't see him. Malcolm was right, he knew it. But after a night like this, all he wanted to do was sleep, to forget about the anger simmering under the surface. "I'm tired," Malcolm Eric said quietly. "I'm tired of fighting every time something like this happens. I just want to live my life, you know." "I get it," Malcolm replied softly. "But that's the thing, Eric. You shouldn't have to fight for that. No one should. But the only way things change is if we keep pushing back. You know that as well as I do." Eric let the words sink in, staring at the cup of coffee in his hands. He had spent his entire career fighting in courtrooms for big corporations, negotiating multi-million-dollar deals. But this was personal. And it wasn't just about him. It was about his community, his family, and every black man and woman who had ever been pulled over for no reason, who had ever felt the cold sting of prejudice. Malcolm's voice broke through his thoughts. "Look, I know you're exhausted, but we can't let this go. Tomorrow, I'm filing a formal complaint with the police department. We're going to expose this for what it is, racial profiling, pure and simple. And I want you with me on this." Eric exhaled slowly. He wasn't sure if he had the energy to take this on, but something inside him stirred. Maybe Malcolm was right. Maybe this was the time to stand up, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been in his shoes. "All right," Eric said finally, his voice firm. "I'm in. Let's do it." The next day, Eric found himself at Malcolm's law office, sitting in a conference room filled with case files and legal documents. The place had an air of purpose, of justice in motion. Malcolm was already on the phone, talking to one of his contacts in the media, trying to get ahead of the story. As Eric waited, he reflected on how different their paths had been. Malcolm had always been the activist, the one who fought for social justice, while Eric had taken a more conventional route. But now, in this moment, their worlds were colliding, and Eric realized that maybe he couldn't stay on the sidelines anymore. When Malcolm finally hung up, he turned to Eric with a determined look in his eyes. "We're going after them, Eric. Not just Daniels, but the entire system that lets guys like him operate unchecked." Eric nodded. "What do you need me to do?" Malcolm smiled, a hint of pride in his eyes. "We start by telling your story. We need to make sure people know what happened. This isn't just about you, it's about changing the culture in that police department, maybe even beyond." As they worked on drafting the complaint and preparing for the media coverage, Eric felt a strange mix of nerves and resolve. This was new territory for him. He was used to high-stakes negotiations, boardroom battles, and corporate strategy. But this was about something far more important. Later that afternoon, they filed the formal complaint with the police department, citing racial profiling and harassment. Eric's statement was detailed and precise, recounting every moment of the two stops. As they left the station, the weight of what they had set in motion settled on his shoulders. But this time it felt lighter. He wasn't just a victim of that night, he was doing something about it. A week passed, and the complaint filed by Eric and Malcolm had already begun making waves. The local media had picked up the story, and it was spreading rapidly, gaining traction far beyond their city. News outlets framed it as a broader issue, highlighting the ongoing problem of racial profiling in law enforcement. Eric's name was attached to it, and while he appreciated the coverage, it also brought a level of discomfort. He had never wanted to be in the spotlight for something like this. Malcolm, on the other hand, thrived in these moments. He was at the forefront of interviews, speaking passionately about police reform and the fight for racial justice. His legal expertise, combined with his personal connection to the case, made him a powerful voice in the movement. One morning, as Eric sat at his desk in his office, his phone buzzed. It was Malcolm. "We've got a problem," Malcolm said, his voice tight with frustration. "What's going on?" Eric asked, already bracing himself for bad news. "Daniels is pushing back hard. He's claiming you were combative during the stop and is trying to paint you as uncooperative in his official report. He's spinning this to make it look like he was just doing his job." Eric's jaw clenched. "That's ridiculous. I stayed calm the entire time. You know that." "I know, but this is how they play the game," Malcolm replied. "They're trying to discredit you so the department doesn't have to admit fault. They're circling the wagons to protect themselves." Eric leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He had done everything by the book, and yet here they were, Daniels twisting the narrative, turning the system against him once again. "So what do we do?" Eric asked. "We keep pushing," Malcolm said. "I've already got a few witnesses lined up. One of them is Officer Brooks. He's willing to talk about what happened that night. He knows Daniels went too far, and I think we can get him to testify." That gave Eric a small glimmer of hope. Brooks had seemed uncomfortable the entire time, and if he was willing to come forward, it could change everything. "All right," Eric said, his resolve hardening. "Let's make sure this doesn't get buried. We need to keep the pressure on." Over the next few days, the legal battle ramped up. Eric and Malcolm appeared on news shows, talking about the case and the larger issue of racial bias in policing. Malcolm handled most of the talking, but Eric's presence was powerful, his calm, measured demeanor standing in stark contrast to the allegations being made against him. As the case gained more attention, it became clear that Daniels' actions weren't isolated. Other victims of racial profiling came forward, sharing their stories. Eric's case was becoming the catalyst for a larger movement, one that was demanding accountability and reform within the police department. The pressure on Daniels continued to mount, and with Officer Brooks agreeing to testify, the department was backed into a corner. Brooks had seen everything that night, and he wasn't willing to lie to protect his partner's ego. His testimony was damning, laying bare the abuse of power that had occurred during the stop. Weeks later, the police department announced that an internal investigation had been launched. Officer Daniels was placed on administrative leave, pending further review of his actions. It was a small victory, but it felt like the beginning of something much larger. One evening, as Eric sat in his living room watching the latest news coverage of the investigation, his phone buzzed with a text from Malcolm. "Malcolm, looks like we're getting somewhere. They can't ignore this any longer." Eric smiled, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. He had spent so much of his life trying to avoid conflict, trying to keep his head down and succeed within the system. But now, for the first time, he felt like he was doing something that truly mattered, not just for himself, but for others like him who had been silenced or ignored for too long. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Eric stood and opened it to find Malcolm standing there, a broad smile on his face. "You watching the news?" Malcolm asked, stepping inside. "Yeah, I just saw it," Eric replied. "Looks like things are finally starting to change." "They are," Malcolm said, his voice filled with pride. "And it's because of you. You could have walked away from this, but you didn't. You stood your ground." Eric shook his head. "It's not just me, it's you and everyone else who's been fighting this fight for years. I just got pushed into it." Malcolm gave him a knowing look. Sometimes it takes getting pushed to make us realize what we need to stand up for. The two brothers sat down, the weight of the last few weeks still heavy, but now tempered with hope. They had set something in motion, something that was bigger than just a single case. It was about justice, about accountability, about a future where men like Eric didn't have to fear for their lives every time they got pulled over. As they talked into the night, planning their next steps and discussing what needed to be done to keep the pressure on, Eric felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't over, far from it. But for the first time he felt like he was on the right side of the fight. And he wasn't alone.